Okay, I'll get started. So I'm Daniel Waldinger. I'm going to talk about public housing market design. And what I hope to accomplish is basically to get you guys interested in this topic. I think this is going to be a more application-driven talk. And I hope to convey that there are a lot of unanswered, interesting questions, both theoretically and empirically, about this type of problem. Okay. So I probably don't have to convince most people here that housing is important, right? It's a basic need, but people also spend a lot of their income on it. This is especially true for the lowest income renters in the US and a lot of countries. So high rent burdens raise a lot of policy concerns about housing affordability. Why are we concerned? Well, policymakers are worried about housing instability, homelessness, eviction, and also if renters are paying a large fraction of their income towards rent, they don't have money left over for other goods. Okay. So, and I think, this has, I think, become even more prominent and visible since the pandemic, but there was an affordability crisis growing in the US before that began. Housing also interacts with many other important markets, right? Where you live can determine access to schools, jobs. It determines the kind of neighborhood you live in. It might affect the people you interact with. So I'm going to talk about how to allocate affordable housing, and I want you guys to have all of these things in mind when thinking about how we should allocate this type of good life. So because of concerns about housing affordability, many countries provide subsidized housing, particularly to lower income households. These programs are often called public housing or social housing, which is what I'll be talking about today. The key feature of these programs is that your rent subsidy is tied to where you live, or living in a specific unit, okay? That's what creates a matching problem. The second feature of these types of problems is that demand for assistance usually exceeds supply of available units, so you end up with a rationing problem, and most programs have wait lists. Okay, so today I'm going to talk about how to think about public housing allocation as a market design problem. This has the structure of a one-side dynamic assignment problem. I'm going to take a particular perspective when I go through the empirical application, which is that we're trying to ration a heterogeneous in-kind transfer, right? So part of what public housing is doing is transferring financial resources to lower income households, and the planner might care about income redistribution as well as efficiency. So I'm going to start by giving just a little bit of background on the theory of dynamic assignment mechanisms. I'm not going to have time to do justice to the theory. Mainly what I want to convey is that design trade-offs depend crucially on preferences, even more than static mechanisms, which motivates empirical work. Then I'll talk about public housing institutions, focusing on the US, but also mentioning a bit about other countries. And then I'll talk about how to do revealed preference analysis in the type of waitlist mechanisms that are used to allocate public housing. And I'll finish with an empirical application I worked on to the waiting list for public housing here in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Okay. All right, so up until now, for all of yesterday and Irene's first lecture the day before, we were talking about static matching problems. Okay, so these are problems where all of the relevant agents on both sides of the market can be present at the same time. So that has an advantage that everyone's preferences can be elicited before any matches are formed. And we have strong theoretical results on the properties of certain ways of allocating resources in those types of problems, right? We know that certain mechanisms are stable, others are strategy-proof, Pareto efficient. And even for mechanisms like the Boston mechanism that don't have those properties necessarily, we kind of understand how incentives to strategize are determined. They're determined by the distribution of final assignments generated by your choices. Okay? So in allocating public housing and other similar problems, timing is an essential aspect of the allocation problem. The key features I want you to have in mind when thinking about this problem is that first, there are stochastic arrivals on both sides of the market. So we don't know when applicants are going to request assistance. We don't know when units are going to become available. The other thing that makes the timing important is that allocation is time sensitive. So one side has to be allocated quickly, either because of political constraints or because of technological constraints. That's going to be important in terms of the ability to centralize the matching process. A third feature is that even though public housing can be thought of as a dynamic market, there's some permanence in the assignments that are generated, okay? Limited future trading opportunities, and there's extreme scarcity. Not all agents can be poached, okay? So given that structure, some agents on one side of the market, right, the side that can wait, are going to have to wait. And that usually generates wait lists. Yeah, question.
So 1.3, I believe there's a paper by Holger Sieg and co-authors where in New York City, they model whether you upgrade to a different type of public housing.
That's true. So what I'll say quickly is that in practice, in most housing systems, it's very difficult to switch apartments unless your family structure changes. So what they're actually picking up is people having kids or people moving out. I think a stronger case for assignments being permanent are organs, where once you get a transplant, you literally can't swap with them. Or it's very costly to do so. Okay. So here's an outline of a one-sided dynamic assignment model that you can use to build intuition about how to design these types of systems. Okay. So this model has a few components that didn't exist before. First, we need a process for arrivals and departures of agents and objects. Okay. So I'm going to go to the laptop so people online can see. So objects are going to be indexed by J, agents by I, and they arrive stochastically over time. Okay, so there are going to be arrival rates for both objects and agents. Lambdas for objects, u's for agents. And when we say that there's scarcity, we mean that there are more agents arriving than objects, right, on average, and so not everyone can be matched. Okay. So again, just to fix ideas for our application, objects here are public housing units that are vacated by the previous tenants. The agents are households applying for benefits. Okay, and depending on the situation, usually vacant public housing apartments need to be allocated quickly, both because it's wasteful to leave them vacant, but also because it looks really bad to have a bunch of empty units. Okay, another feature which ends up being important on most waitlist applications that I've looked at is departures of agents who haven't been assigned anything. Okay, so what you often see on public housing waitlists and also waitlists for organs is that over time, people will leave the queue for various reasons. In public housing, it's usually because applicants stop responding to mail or don't come in for one of their appointments, and so they're removed from the list. This might seem like kind of a weird thing, but it actually plays an important market clearing role when you look at any waitlist data. As the waiting list gets longer and people have to wait longer, more people will depart before they can get an assignment. And so if the market becomes more congested, you basically need waiting times to increase so more people can depart without an assignment and the market clears. Okay. The last component is the preferences of the agents. This is a one-sided matching problem. So we're not thinking about the preferences of organs or public housing apartments, but agents have values. These values I'm going to denote by Vij, and those have some distribution that in general could depend on the agents and the objects characteristics. Okay. And from a market designer's point of view, these are private information. The challenge is to achieve the best matching you can without knowing exactly what these views are. Okay, Whitney.
I have a question from online. Is it possible to think of stochastic arrivals as entry decision questions, or are these decisions too complicated to model?
Oh, there are models of the entry decision. One thing about the framework I'm setting up here is that we're actually assuming there's no explicit cost of waiting. That's kind of realistic in a setting like public housing where, being on the waiting list doesn't require you to stand in line or actually do anything. But because people discount the future, they would still prefer to get assignments sooner. So that generates preferences over waiting time. That's relevant because in a model where there are direct waiting costs, then the decision to join the queue is a decision about whether the expected costs of waiting exceed the expected value of your assignment, right? And so as waiting times get longer, that's actually how markets would clear, even if agents don't depart the queue without an assignment. Eventually, people will start deciding not to join the queue. So different types of models, actually, market clearing happens through that endogenous decision of whether to join the queue. Great. Any other questions? Yeah, sure.
I think there was a white paper that showed that people that are like at this continuity of getting on a wait list to sort their behavior and expectation, like in expecting to get off the wait list at some point. like, is there a way to incorporate their potential weight loss or welfare loss from being from waiting?
Could you,
Sorry.
could you repeat?
Yeah, I think I can't remember the name of the paper, but I think there was a paper that shows that when people are on the wait list versus just barely based on when they signed up not on the wait list, they distort their behavior based on their expectations of like future transfers.
Interesting. Yeah. Okay.
Is
So
there a way
that's
to incorporate their like the welfare events.
right. I'm not familiar with that particular study. That would be an extension of this model for sure. It does have the flavor of a cost of waiting, but I think the way you would probably think about that is there's some reason people are changing their behavior in response to what they expect to get through the wait list, and so you'd probably want to incorporate that into your model. In the model I'm going to think about today, there isn't an explicit cost of waiting, and your future opportunities don't distort what you do while you don't have public housing. So you could definitely think about that, and that could be important in some applications. Any other questions? Okay, so now I want to pause for 2 minutes, take a page from the playbook of Irene and Paolo, and ask you guys to turn to your neighbor and talk for 2 minutes about what the goal should be of allocating a resource like public housing. So imagine that you run a housing agency that can choose how to allocate these units. What criteria should we use to decide what a good allocation is and what a bad allocation is? All right, this is really open-ended and normative, so I just want you guys to discuss for a minute.
You should tell us. So the way we think about it, so basically, like what you said, we need a these buildings are there. So you don't want some because we don't see. So make it simple. Also, when you this one thing. So you can't say so this one. So you're like this is teaching that. You don't everything about data like on average. Yes.
Okay, so it's been about 2 minutes.
But also,
Sorry to interrupt all of your, I'm sure, brilliant discussions, but let's start collecting answers. Okay, so would any group like to propose some design goals or considerations that you want to think about as a public housing agency? There's really no right answer here. So.
Yeah, so we were talking about the mechanism should take the full social cost of waiting. So if there's heterogeneous agents, then some might have higher externalities than others.
Okay, yep. So, and by social cost of waiting, you mean like while you're waiting?
Like a family with children should be preferred, perhaps, instead of somebody who doesn't have children.
So. Okay, and you might think of these social costs as being distinct from like an actual cost of waiting that is like money. Okay. Oh, sorry.
I guess kind of related, you might want to think about depending on the exact policy you're thinking about, you might want to think about the incentives on the supply side to provide more housing or.
Yeah, so in what we're going to talk about today, the supply of public housing is going to be fixed, just like predetermined. You might also be interested in interactions with the private market for housing. Which I think is a very interesting topic, but I'll have nothing to say about it. I think that's a great point. Yeah.
Another consideration is how long you'll need the social housing, right? So if we supply it to you immediately and you might only need 14 days and then can move on, but if you don't get it immediately, you'll be stuck in the system for a couple of years.
Got it. So you're thinking that the value of allocating it to someone both affects their value of the good, but also how long they'll need it.
Yeah, and you know, if you only need it for 14 days, if you give it to you immediately, then there is some sort of trade-off on that part, right? Like, so say you enter late in the queue, but we can get you out of the system fast, then you might want to.
Okay. So maybe like whether your need is temporary or long-term. Okay, anyone else?
Making sure that on an average waiting time is low. So like there's knowing the departures, how should you allocate so that you know when it will become vacant. For example, you know what type of there's the appropriateness of housing that you should not give a one bedroom to a family.
Oh, okay. So it sounds like you're talking about match quality, right?
Yeah, but, so the match quality and wait times, considering some, different matches should have different wait times, like a family wait time versus like a one person waiting time.
Okay, and waiting, so this is actually an interesting thing to talk about for a minute. Why is it important to have short waiting times? Suppose we have a fixed stock of housing. We're going to find someone who can take any given unit. So people are going to wait. Is there a reason why we would worry about long waiting times or short waiting times per se?
I mean, like short waiting times implies it might lead to a bad match. So
because waiting times act like a price. So you're thinking about the incentive properties of waiting times.
And long waiting times is bad.
There's like a trade-off between strength of screening and the costs that you could have very, very strict eligibility requirements or try to grade people along a bunch of different sort of goal dimensions just to get to see who can use it the most, but that could impose costs that that could be overall functioning of the system.
Okay, yeah. So you might worry about behavioral responses to priorities.
Yeah, also just like the like if you have a fixed budget, you have to allocate some budget to screenings versus like producing housing or having a better functioning.
So these are like the costs of administering the waitlist system, actually rationally. All right, we'll take one more.
So I don't know if this is super relevant to public housing if you have long wait lists, but I could imagine that you might not want to clear like each available unit right away if you don't have a great match in your queue already, because you couldn't have one arrive later. So that, I don't know if in practice, but
Right. Okay, so I'm going to stop here. I think this is a great list. It's actually a list that combines both sort of like design goals and concerns about the incentive properties of different mechanisms, right? I'm going to now talk about how sort of the dynamic assignment literature has thought about the design goals of allocating public housing. But I think this is a useful exercise that you should always go through whenever you confront a new market or market design problem. I'm actually going to make assumptions that shut down most of these issues, either because of policy constraints on what the designer can do, or just because of modeling assumptions. But there are a lot of settings where all of these things might be relevant. Okay? Batching in particular is important when both sides of the market can wait. So if you think about kidney exchange, where you have living donor and patient pairs, they're batching. The question of how to batch is really important. Okay. So to a large extent, a lot of the theory on dynamic assignment has started with a utilitarian welfare criterion based on the value generated by the assignments that are generated by the mechanism. Okay, so basically, we can think of the welfare from a particular matching U as the expected value that we get from the allocated objects. So sorry about that. Why are we thinking about it this way? Well, first of all, these V's could be defined very broadly, right? They might be defined based on the preferences of the agents who are receiving the match. They could be based on some other social welfare criterion. Maybe there are externalities that make us think the value of housing someone is different from their own value of being housed. Regardless, what the planner wants to do when an object becomes available is find the highest value agent that exists, in the economy for each object that becomes available. Okay? Of course, thinking about dynamic capacity constraints. One point here is that if we assume there's no waiting costs, waiting times don't directly enter the social welfare function, right? Because regardless, someone is going to not be receiving housing and is going to have to wait. But there are other models where waiting costs, are explicit and do matter and affect the optimal discipline. Okay. One thing that no one mentioned when I asked for design goals was any of the axiomatic properties that we talked about for static mechanisms. And that has been less of a focus in the one-sided dynamic assignment literature. I think for a couple of different reasons. For one thing, because objects don't have preferences and aren't strategic, we don't worry about stability in the same sense that we would in the two-sided static matching problem. It's also true that properties like strategy proofness are unlikely to be satisfied by dynamic mechanisms. The basic problem here is that agents face a choice when they reveal information to the mechanism that affects both like what you get, but also when, right? So if you're waiting for different public housing apartments, you might want to take an apartment that you don't prefer the most, but that has a shorter waiting time in order to be housed quickly, right? This will happen just through exponential discounting. Of course, the planner doesn't want you to do that. They would like you to just tell you your value conditional on assignment because someone's going to be waiting. So designing strategy-proof mechanisms is difficult in this setting. And I think that's one reason why sort of, these axiomatic criteria have received less attention. Yeah.
Why not just have a victory auction, you bunch arrivals into little batches of time and hold a victory auction, and you have the incentive problem solved and you're allocating it to the highest valuation person.
A victory auction using money or using.
Yeah. And then you provide a subsidy or rebate after the fact to the winner to subsidize part of the cost.
Yeah, and I mean, this gets into I think a deeper question about this whole thing, which is why are we choosing to, first of all, subsidize housing and then allocate it not using price? I think presumably there are some equity considerations that are sort of outside this model that justify that. But I think that one thing is that, once you've gone through the empirical exercise I'm going to talk about, you could actually run a victory auction and see how it performs, right? And how market thickness and other things would matter for the performance. Okay. Okay. Now, when you look at the types of allocation mechanisms that are actually used to allocate things like affordable housing and that have been considered in the theory, there are a huge number of different sort of ways you could organize the queue, okay? I'm not going to give a formal treatment of dynamic mechanisms, but I just want to give a sense of the range of different systems that are actually used, okay? So one component of any allocation system is going to be the rule that you use to decide who to offer an object to first when it arrives, okay? How do you order people who are waiting for the object? Part of that could be how do you use waiting time to order agents, right? So probably the simplest example we can think of a queue is just a simple first come, first served wait list, right? We offer each object to the person who's waited the longest. And then if they say no, we go down the list in reverse order of waiting time. You could also do the reverse. You could order people in reverse order of waiting time, or you could not use waiting time at all and just run a lottery every time an object becomes available. That doesn't consider waiting time, okay? So in the next lecture, Nikhil is going to talk about how these different queuing disciplines can actually give agents very different incentives for what to choose. Another thing you can do is use observable characteristics. So maybe proxies for need or for the externalities that you might have while you're waiting to prioritize applicants you think, but have the highest social value of being housed. Okay. The other component of an allocation system is what choices the agents can make while they're on the waiting list. And at least for the systems that are used, there are really two types of systems that we've seen. The first, which again is going to be more the focus of the next lecture, is a sequential offer mechanism. So this is a mechanism where you're free to decline items that are offered to you and wait for something better. Okay, so that's a lot like how kidneys are allocated in the US. In public housing, it's actually more common to penalize rejections, but to allow applicants to pre-specify what types of housing they want to wait for. So in some cities, you can say, I want to wait for just this development, set a waiting list for that development and only receive offers. That asks you to commit to what you want. In other cities, you actually don't get to pre-specify anything. And if you reject the first offer that you get, which is just whatever happens to be available, you're removed from the wait list. Okay. And there are lots of intermediate systems that I'll talk more about. Yeah.
What if we have new developments being added after you've specified the developments you want?
Oh, right. So again, everything I talk about in this talk is going to hold supply, which here is the set of developments fixed. But I think an interesting set of counterfactuals that you might want to do is like, what would happen if you added new developments? Maybe you would want to ask, what would be the most valuable investments in the public housing stock? When I talk about how public housing actually works in the US, I think it'll be clear why we're focusing on fixed supply here, but I think that's an important, interesting question. Okay, so we have all these different types of mechanisms that you can use to allocate public housing. And there are now like a fair number of theory papers about this. One thing that's very different between the theory on dynamic assignment and static matching is that we really don't have general results for general preference distributions on the optimal design of the waitlist, right? So even if you say, I'm interested in utilitarian criterion, and all I want to do is maximize the value of assignments, it's actually very difficult to give general advice based on the theory we have. We do have some results for specific cases, so structures of assumptions about preferences. So for example, if preferences are horizontal, so everyone's preferences for a given object are drawn from the same distribution, then there are results showing that often first come, first served, when agents can decline items, performs very well. Because as you wait, your priority increases, and that induces agents to be very selective, right? They'll only accept offers that have a really high match value. And that can be very good, but there can be a trade-off if objects can be rejected by everyone and discarded. So in some cases, there's a trade-off between match quality and the number of discards, which Nikhil is going to talk more about. Now, so if preferences are horizontal, it's often very good to use first come, first served and allow rejections. But actually, you can break that simply by adding persistent agent heterogeneity. Okay, so by that, what I mean is suppose that each agent's value of a given object has two components. One is an epsilon draw that is drawn from the same distribution for everyone. And one is an individual effect, this eta. Okay, so this eta shifts for a given applicant your value of all objects up or down. Okay, so there are some people who just really want to get something, but still have preferences over which thing they get. Other people who have fairly low values and might only actually be interested in accepting certain items. Okay, and in this case, there can be a trade-off, even if there are no discards, between finding good matches and matching agents with high etas, so high average values of being assigned. And in some cases, running a lottery that doesn't prioritize based on waiting time, or even penalizing rejections, can screen out low need agents. Whether this trade-off exists and which one you actually would want to focus on, would you want to focus on maximizing match quality or maximizing targeting? That's going to depend on the shape and support of these two distributions. The distributions of match values, the epsilons, and the distribution of agents' average values, the etas. Okay. And in more general cases, we really don't know, although there, we do get some intuition about what different types of systems will do from the theory that applies to the special cases.
Is this like housing vouchers and that people who get vouchers have to pay a certain share of their income, or is it completely, there's no break?
Yeah, I'm going to talk a lot more about institutions in a few slides. But it works exactly the same financially for US public housing. Great. So now I'm going to spend a little bit of time on public housing institutions. One thing that you'll find when you start looking at housing allocation systems is they're very local and they have tons of different features. But there are some common aspects that are likely to arise wherever you look. So if you look across the OECD, all right, public housing is actually a substantial share of all of the rental housing that exists, right? It's about 6% of the rental housing stock on average in the US and Europe. But when you look at specific countries, there's huge variability in how large these programs are. In the Netherlands, more than 1 in 3 rental units are part of the public housing program. In the US, it's less than 4%. Now, despite the huge range in the scope of the program, there are a couple of things that are usually true. So one thing that's often true is that these programs are sort of funded and regulated at the national level, but then local agencies have a lot of control over the details of how the program's implemented and allocation policy. That's especially true in the US. The other thing is that even though there are these huge differences in total supply, there are also large differences in demand. And in most countries, public housing is rationed in some way. So more households who are eligible demand assistance than there are available units. Now, in the US, public housing is one of a few different low-income rental subsidy programs. In total, the federal government spends about $50 billion a year on these programs. The public housing program serves about 1.1 million households, and it only accounts for about $10 billion a year of this spending. What distinguishes public housing from other programs is that your subsidy is tied to a unit that's administered by a local housing authority. Okay, so the US Congress allocates funding to public housing, and the Department of Housing and Urban Development sets the rules, but PHAs have control over a lot of the local details of how the program is administered. Okay. Now, it's useful to pause for a moment and understand why there actually is a scarcity problem, because in most cases, this is a policy choice. So in the US, there are 3 features of the public housing program that create scarcity and therefore a rational problem. The first is that eligibility criteria are actually pretty broad. So almost anyone can apply for public housing if they earn less than 80% of the area median income. So that's a regional income measure adjusted for household size, but almost half of people in most cities are eligible. Most of you are probably eligible for public housing where you live, as long as students are allowed to apply, which is not true in Cambridge. So many households are eligible, and in addition, the benefits are quite generous. So what's the benefit? Well, if you live in public housing, you pay a fixed fraction of your income towards rent. It's 30% of your pre-tax income. It doesn't depend on where you live, right? It only depends on your income. And for most very low income households, this is a huge rent subsidy. In addition to being very generous while you have it, once you get public housing, you're entitled to continued assistance as long as you pay your rent to stay in your unit. So public housing is actually unusual in the US in that it's not an entitlement for those who are eligible, but once you get it, you can keep it. So in that sense, getting a public housing unit is very valuable. The third reason is that there's fixed supply. So for a variety of reasons, new public housing is not being built in the US. So if you're a low-income household who would like housing assistance, first of all, well, there are two things. The first is that housing agencies are stuck with the housing stock that they have, which was generated by historical processes. But also as an applicant, even if you thought about applying for other affordable housing programs, those are also in limited supply for various other reasons. So everything is rationed, including public housing. So local housing authorities, as I mentioned, actually administer these programs. They maintain the public housing stock, and they have a lot of control over allocation policy. What they don't control are the rules that create scarcity. Those are determined at the federal level, okay? But those are policy choices, and I think it's kind of an interesting observation that the same kind of rationing problem happens for housing specifically in a lot of different countries with very different programs. Yeah.
Just out of curiosity, the remaining 40 billions are spent on subsidizing private housing or something else?
Yeah, there are a few programs. So about 20 billion goes to housing choice vouchers, which is a demand side subsidy to rent on the private market. About 10 billion is for something called project-based Section 8, which is basically place-based assistance, but with private owners who do their own allocation. And then the last bit is the low-income housing tax credit, which is actually how new affordable housing is being built. But that works very differently from public housing. The allocation also is incentivized.
Also, out of curiosity, since the screening is only based on current income, what's the policy incentive for making the allocation more basically permanent?
Can you speak up a little? Sorry.
Like, was this an active policy choice that once you get allocated, you basically got permanently entitled to that? Like,
Right.
instead of maybe making it 5-year, 10-year terms, was that like for historical reason or?
I don't have a great answer to why. I think that probably the reason is political. So the guidelines for housing authorities are that you don't kick out tenants who are, complying with the terms of their lease. I think probably the reason is that it just looks really bad to make someone leave their house. But I think, right, if you look at this program at a high level, right, and you think, how would we want to design an in-kind transfer program to help the poor? Doing it this way seems kind of crazy. Like, why would you have a subsidy that's really generous, but that you have to ration to people who are observably similar, right? So that's kind of the reason I got interested in this topic to begin with, is like, is there something about the rationing process that's actually making it optimal to have a program that's structured this way? I didn't get there, but I think it's an important question. It's worth thinking about. Great. Okay, so now let's take the applicant's perspective and talk about how the application process works. Okay, this is going to help us understand how I structure the choice problem that people are facing. So if you would like housing assistance, the first thing you do is you submit an application to the housing authority in your local area. So you give them a bunch of information about your household. This information determines your priority in the system, if they prioritize based on observed characteristics, and also which units you're eligible for. So it determines the number of bedrooms of the apartment you can get. And also it might affect which developments you could actually live in. The other thing that happens when you first apply is that in most housing agencies, you're asked to make some choice about what developments to wait for. Usually these choices are not ranked, so you don't submit a rank order list. Instead, what you do is you specify some set of developments and sit on the waiting list for those developments. That's in cities where you're allowed to make some choice over where you're offered units from. So after the initial application, you wait, often for a long time. And these waiting lists are ordered first by priority group, and then within priority group, there's a first come, first served tiebreaker. So in some cities, it's basically a first come, first served wait list because there aren't really many priorities. Other places, the priorities matter a lot. Now, once you get close to the top of the list, the housing authority is going to call you in for a screening appointment. That's when they ask you to actually verify that you're eligible. So you submit all your documentation. They also check that you had the priorities that you claimed. And then if you get through that, you're offered a unit. At this point, almost no housing authority will let you reject an offer without penalty. Instead, you usually have to accept the first or maybe the second offer that you're given, or you're removed from the wait list. Okay. And the other thing, which I already mentioned, is that this is, again, a policy choice. It's usually very difficult to transfer once you get into public housing. So these assignments have some sort of finality, right? Pretty much if your family structure has to change to get reassigned. So given this structure, where choices are mostly made at the beginning of the application process, and you're deciding what to wait for and receive offers from, this is really kind of a static but forward-looking decision where you're trading off maybe waiting time and your preferred assignment. That's actually quite different from the sequential offer mechanisms that are used to allocate organs and some other types of affordable housing, which have repeated lotteries or have you actively choose which developments to apply for as they become available. So those generate a dynamic discrete choice problem, which Nikhil will talk about how to analyze. Okay. So those features that I just described of the application process are, I think, the case for most housing agencies. There are large differences, though, in how the application process works along at least two dimensions. And these are the ones I ended up focusing on, the empirical application. The first is how much choice applicants have over what units they can be offered, and particularly whether they can omit any development that they want. And then priority. So cities actually differ a lot in how economic variables like income and socioeconomic status are used to prioritize applicants. Just as a couple examples, if you look at the allocation system used in Seattle, they do something that's similar to Choose One, where you're asked to list up to 3 developments at the beginning of the application process, and you then have to accept the first offer from any of those developments. That's asking you to commit to what you want, and it lets you omit any development you don't want. The priority system is focused on targeting arguably more economically vulnerable households. So they first will offer housing to homeless people and families below 30% of the median income than other households. That system is very different from the system that was current in Los Angeles in 2016. There, they offered very little choice over what units you might be offered. You had to accept the first or second offer from pretty much any development in the city. And the priority system did almost the opposite of what Seattle does. They actually prioritize what they would call working families, so households with a working or studying member, or households who are economically self-sufficient. So it seems like these choice and priority systems are doing very different things and might be designed with different goals in mind. Okay, so before going into the empirics, I want to talk about a particular trade-off that I'm going to focus on in the empirical application between efficiency and redistribution. I'll be more precise later about what I mean by those things. But the motivation is that, given that public housing is scarce, and that motivates directing resources to those who are most in need, where need, you can argue about what that means, but we might have social preferences over who should go first and be prioritized for this housing. So you can see when you start thinking about these different systems that housing agencies are using, that the way you design the wait list could really matter for how much redistribution is achieved. So you can think about 2 sort of model choice systems that are similar to ones used in practice in US cities. If you think about Choose One, so that's a process where you choose one development to wait for, beginning the application process. That's generally going to provide good match quality. It has a lot of similar properties to first come, first served with rejections. Because it allows you to wait for your preferred option, it actually forces you to say which thing you want, okay? That mechanism is sort of the opposite from no choice, which is kind of like the mechanism that Los Angeles uses, where applicants are offered the first apartment that becomes available and they have to accept it, or the second offer. This system is used in large cities where you might get offered things all around the jurisdiction of the PHA. You can see pretty quickly that not allowing choice is probably going to produce worse matches for the people who are housed, right? Because you're going to often have to accept fairly mismatched offers in order to be housed. But there is a potential advantage to using no choice, which is that it might be a good screening device. Whether it is a good screening device is an empirical question. But to understand when it would be useful, well, it would be improved targeting if applicants who have good outside options, who we think don't really need assistance, are more likely to reject a random mismatched offer of housing. If that's true, then they'll be more likely to self-select out of the application process and make room for more high-need applicants who would accept anything. Okay, that's the story where removing choice might actually be good for social welfare if it improves targeting. Okay, this is related to the idea that I mentioned in Arnowski and Shi, where there's this trade-off between match quality and targeting. It's also related to a very interesting literature in public economics on ordeals for public programs, right? So there's this idea that, the fact that not everyone actually bothers to apply for food stamps or claim the EITC, that might actually be a good thing if the people who don't bother to do it are the ones who don't really need assistance. It actually allows us to transfer more resources to the people who are really desperate. So of course, it's an empirical question whether ordeals are actually screening out the right people. And in this case, what I'll be interested in the empirical application is whether a mechanism like no choice might be a good screening device and whether we should actually try to use it. Okay. Questions here? Okay. So I first want to talk in a way that's a little bit detached from the empirical application I'll go through about the empirical content of choices in a waitlist mechanism. So the first thing I want to do is think about how would you model preferences for something like public housing, where you care not only about what you're assigned, but how long you have to wait. So probably the simplest model you could write down that has those two features is the following. So we can think about applicants as having preferences over different public housing developments, right? So that's usually what they're choosing on these wait lists. The developments are going to be indexed by J. And applicants have flow payoffs that depend on where they're living. So Vij is going to be the indirect flow utility from living in development J. Vi0 is going to be the flow payoff from whatever your best alternative is if you don't have public housing, okay? For today, I'm going to think of these as not being time dependent, but you could add time dependence. That wouldn't fundamentally change things. And households have time preferences. They discount the future at a continuous rate. So with this preference structure, if an agent is housed in development J and T years, then the net present value of their future flow payoffs has two parts. The first part is the value of the outside option while they're waiting. The second part is the value of their assignment once they get it. Okay, and here we're again thinking of assignments as being permanent. So you just get Vij in perpetuity after assignment. We can write that net present value in two components. That's going to be useful for formulating the choice problem. The first component is the net present value if you never got anything, right? If you just stayed with your outside option forever. And the second component is the incremental value of your assignment relative to your outside option. And of course, that's discounted by the amount of time you have to wait to get it. Okay. So in terms of applicants' decisions on a wait list, this part is going to be the decision relevant component. Okay. The discounted payoffs at assignment. Now, what can we then learn from choices on a wait list? Well, there's actually a strong analog to the framework that Paolo presented yesterday in models where you make your choices ex ante. So on where you make one choice of initial application. Okay, so let's suppose that we're in a one-stage choice mechanism. We can think of these mechanisms as allowing you to choose certain subsets of developments for which you're going to wait. Okay, so this script C is sort of the choice rule of a mechanism. And that's going to be some subset of all the subsets of developments. That differs depending on the mechanism, right? So for choose one, this script C is just all of the singletons. You can wait for at most one development. In no choice, you only have one option. You have to wait for everything. Another system that is used in Boston, or was in 2016, is what I call choose any subset, which is basically where you can list any subset of developments and sit on a waiting list for those. Okay. So whatever this choice set is, an applicant is going to, sorry about that. An applicant is going to choose whatever subset of developments among those allowed that maximize their expected discounted payoff for whatever assignment they can expect to get. Okay. So they are going to average these discounted payoffs over the distributions of assignments and waiting times generated by the mechanism. Okay, so that's going to depend on their choice and also whatever information they have about the state of the queue and the equilibrium of the system. Okay, so this problem actually has a fairly similar structure to the choices over lotteries that Paolo talked about yesterday. Now the relevant distributions are over assignments and waiting times. Okay, so you can sort of think of this choice problem as something where we can learn a lot about people's preferences and the strength of their preferences for specific options based on their choices over these lotteries.
Daniel, would you have a stopping problem? So suppose you sign up for 2 apartments.
Mhm.
One is offered right away, but you like the second one. But if you turn down the first one, you may not be offered the second one.
Right. So if there's uncertainty about whether you'd get the second offer, then you would face, that would be an optimal stopping problem, right?
Yeah.
In practice, it's usually probability 1 or 0, right? You know that you'll either get kicked off the wait list if you reject, or you know that you have 1 rejection that you're allowed. Yeah, so, and what I'm going to think about, there are no interior probabilities of another offer, but that would be a natural extension in system if that was the case. Yeah. Okay. Great. So now I'm going to talk about some work that I did. I started it while I was in graduate school on public housing allocation in Cambridge, Massachusetts. So I'll present the project, but I'll also try to talk about, as Nikhil did, sort of how, a bit about the research process, like how I thought about the problem and sort of what I learned over the course of it. Okay. So this project is studying the Cambridge Housing Authority. That's the housing authority that manages public housing and vouchers in Cambridge, Massachusetts. When I started this project, I was really interested in public housing waitlist broadly, right? I thought there were lots of interesting questions that you could ask. And I went around asking lots of different housing agencies for data. It turns out that in the US and in many places, the federal government doesn't actually collect data on who's on public housing waitlists. It only has data on beneficiaries. So this waitlist data rests with the local agencies that are doing the allocation, and you have to convince one of them to give it to you. So I played the poor grad student card, and it worked for one city, Cambridge. So the data I got from them contained information on their wait lists between 2010 and 2014. In the analysis, I ended up focusing on public housing because it turned out that the voucher wait lists were closed during the period I was studying. So if you were a new applicant seeking affordable housing, you really only had public housing as an option during that period, at least for a while. So the data on the wait lists has 2 parts. It has applicant characteristics that are reported on their applications. So this includes things like their income, the demographics and family structure, and the city and zip code where they currently live. The other information it contains is the choices they make while on the wait list. I'll talk a little more about the Cambridge mechanism in a moment, but I see the timing and decisions of all the events during the application process. Okay. And then I also augmented this data to figure out who is eligible to apply, but might not have, using the ACS. Okay. So this is a map of Cambridge. We're over here. Public housing is over there. So there are 13 family public housing developments that applicants had choice over during the period I was studying. You can see that they're located in different parts of Cambridge, and they also differ in other ways that I'll talk about later. So here's how the choice process works, or did work when I was studying the allocation mechanism in Cambridge. This is different from the ex-ante choice mechanisms I talked about earlier, because there are actually 2 stages of choice that ended up being important for my empirical strategy. In the first stage, when you first apply, you're asked to make an initial choice of up to 3 developments. You can choose 2 or 1 if you want. This isn't your final choice. This forms your choice set in the second stage. That second stage, which I call the final choice, asks you to pick one development from the initial choice that you made before. Okay, so the initial choice really forms your choice set in the second stage. And something that's going to be important for the empirical strategy I took is that it turned out that applicants got new information at this final choice stage. They were told their current position on each of the waiting lists in their choice set. Okay, and that actually generated a natural experiment that I'll talk about and let me measure sensitivity to waiting time. So once you've made this final choice, you're committed in the sense that if you get offered a unit, you have to accept it or you're kicked off the waiting list and can't reapply for a year. In terms of the priority system, there's equal priority for applicants living or working in Cambridge. There are a couple emergency priorities that affect almost no one. And basically, if you have this priority of living or working in the jurisdiction, you can get housing. It's a first come, first served wait list. And for everyone else, there's no chance. So I'm only going to think about applicants who have this priority. Okay, any questions about the mechanism before we continue? Yeah.
What is the time frame between the two choices?
Oh yeah, that depends on the initial choice that you make. So the Cambridge Housing Authority actually had a sort of a rule. It's not a formal rule that they followed, but what they would do is they would look at the wait list periodically, and they would look at which developments were going to need more people to fill vacancies soon. And they would ask people who were waiting for those developments to make a final choice. They would batch these things. So they'd send like dozens of letters at once and see who responds. So it's actually the timing of the final choice depends on your initial choice, obviously, and it depends on the equilibrium of the system, right? And that's something I'll actually have to account for in the analysis. Yeah.
Just for that. So you said that most housing was permanent. So these vacancies arise only in case of death.
You're asking why are there vacancies if the assignments are permanent? Yeah, a number of reasons. People do get old, move out, die, right? That's one reason. And there are some people who choose to move out of public housing, right? Maybe their situation changes or they decide they want to live elsewhere. And the last reason is that some people are evicted. Not a lot in Cambridge, but if you don't pay rent or cause a nuisance, you can get kicked out. So those are the main reasons.
What do you mean by permanent? Like when I enter the system, maybe my income is low, but somehow my income changed in 3 years.
Oh yeah, so you're asking.
They don't check this.
No, that's actually up to the local PHA. Some cities do, and some don't. In Cambridge, they don't kick you out, but it is very rare, based on the data that I had, that someone would actually go over the income limit.
Because there's no contract. It's like it's not a yearly contract or something. I don't need to give information about my income or like how much.
So actually, no. So you do sign a yearly contract with the housing agency, and you recertify. That's what it's called every year. So you kind of like update them on all your information. So, but what they won't do is kick you out in Cambridge if your income rises above the eligibility threshold. They could do that. And every once in a while, there's an article saying, oh, someone who makes 6 figures is in public housing. This is terrible. But it affects almost no one, it turns out, because most of the people who end up applying and getting in are very far from the income threshold.
So these vacancy rates are like in the model, they're same across developments or they're different? Is there a differential vacancy rate across developments in the model?
Yes. So developments, first of all, are just different sizes. So even if the vacancy rate is the same at the unit level, there are different rates across developments, and I'll account for that. What I don't do is endogenize the vacancy rate. That's not something I can really consider with the data I have.
So did anybody look into like the moral hazard problem of not being kicked out if your income rises?
So you're thinking I suppress my income in order to get public housing,
Yeah, but it's
and then I
quite a lot of money, right?
yeah. So for one thing, if you actually can earn a lot of money, your rent does depend on your income, and your rent subsidy is a lot less generous if you're close to the eligibility threshold. So it's not so valuable to do that. The other thing is just in practice, it turned out to be the case that the eligibility threshold is almost non-binary. Very few people who are at the limit are actually applying. It's mostly people who are way below, and it doesn't seem like that's an option for them. You'd see a lot more people approaching that limit if that were happening.
It could also be like a quality component. If
Say
you want to
again?
move out, because maybe the quality is lower in the public housing.
Yeah, so that's, I mean, probably one reason why, you wouldn't want it is that then you don't have a lot of choice. I think,
You talked about not being able to endogenize the vacancy. What data would you have needed to do that?
I would have wanted, so in principle, I could. Given the time frame I had and the number of units, it was just hard to estimate a very reliable vacancy process. And in particular, what you would want is to observe a household from the very beginning of the application process through exit, right? Because you want to see if you got a good match or a bad match, or you got a more or less desirable development, does that impact how long you stay? So a much longer panel, I think, would have been needed to do that correctly. So I didn't, but I think it's, that is potentially important, right? And when people talk about, say, improving match quality in public housing, one thing that you might worry about is that it affects turnover, which could be a good thing or a bad thing, depending on.
Did you see people moving out like within the time frame that you have?
There are some move outs for the reasons that I described earlier. But again, it was hard to link that to the choices they made earlier, because for most of them, I didn't have any information on even when they applied or what they did on the wait list.
What's the information set of applicants? Like, could the.
Oh, yeah. So I'm gonna talk about that.
Is it possible for me to apply for a house that has the least living time? And
Can
then,
you speak up?
and then once I move in, I choose to apply for another house, which I really want.
So you're saying,
Question was, if you're homeless, can you apply for the unit that has the least waiting time and then apply again?
and then trade up. That's not easy to do. What you can do is apply for public housing, and then later on, once the voucher waitlist open, you could also apply for a voucher. So in that sense, you could trade up. That's something that's going to be outside my model, because I don't have data from when the voucher waitlist is open. But it's very hard to reapply once you're already in public housing.
So Cambridge does allow people to apply for public house, even though you live in public house at the moment.
That's true. But it would be very difficult to, I saw very little of that. I did think about whether that, it seems like something that should happen, right? If you don't like your current apartment, you should just sit on a waiting list, which in principle is costless for something else. And that just empirically happened very little. I think one reason might just be that there are moving costs, and once people get something, usually they don't want to move, even if they would like something better ex ante. But I think more broadly, right, I think there's a lot of scope for thinking about what if we allowed people to trade or rematch once they were assigned housing. There's potentially a lot of value that you could create by making that easier, just not something housing authorities do now. At least for the ones that. Okay. Great. So once I got this data, I wanted to see what was going on. And here are the facts that sort of stood out to me and kind of guided the structural modeling that I'll talk about later. So the 13 developments that I show you, they differ in location, like where they are within Cambridge. They also differ in other ways. So one thing that varies a lot is the size of the development. So some of the public housing in Cambridge are like large complexes with hundreds of units. Others are small buildings that kind of look like everything around. They blend in with the surrounding housing. And so the character of the development in the neighborhood varies a fair amount, although I think everything in Cambridge is pretty nice by national standards. Waiting times also vary, right? If you look at the average time to being housed for the applicants who were housed during my sample period, that averages between 2 to 4 years, depending on the development. Okay, so there is some choice about what to wait for, and there might be a trade-off between waiting for less time and getting the thing you really want. Now, I talked about the 2 stages of development choice, but really there are 3 choices, at least, that you make when you're applying for housing. The first decision is just whether to apply at all, okay? that probably reveals at least that you would be interested in some development over your outside option that's being offered. Okay. So from the ACS, I estimated the distribution of households that were eligible. And those estimates suggest that most eligible households actually don't apply. Only about 1 in 4 do. Those who do tend to be lower income, which you definitely expect based on the generosity of the rent subsidy, which varies with income, and they're more likely to be non-white. Now, conditional on applying, then I also have a lot of information about what you want from your initial and final choices. Okay, so from initial choices, you first of all see some correlations on observable characteristics. One thing you notice is that applicants who already live in Cambridge request developments that are already in their current neighborhood. So that suggests that location is part of what is driving preferences here. And higher income applicants are also more selective. This evidence is a little bit weaker, but it does seem like applicants who report higher incomes are more likely to pick developments with longer waiting times and are more likely to choose just 1 or 2 developments instead of the 3 that you could choose. The last stage is the final choice. And I'm going to show you evidence that applicants get new information about waiting times and that their choices respond to it. Okay, so how does this final choice process work? So I already talked a little bit about what determines when you get asked to make the final choice. Once you do, what happens is the housing authority sends you a letter. Okay, applicants receive a letter that tells them their position number on each of the lists in their choice set. Okay, so these are just numbers. They're not waiting time predictions. But it looks, when you look at choices, as though applicants are taking that information, making some projection and responding to it. Okay. Now, the ideal experiment would be that you take applicants with the same preferences or the same distribution of preferences and randomly give them different information about waiting times. Now, in the Cambridge mechanism, you can actually get fairly close to that because you can look at applicants who made the same initial choice. So the first 3 chose the same first 3 developments. Assuming that their preferences are drawn from the same distribution, which I'll justify in a moment, then you can look at response to the waiting time information and sort of isolate the response to information that isn't driven by selection into which developments are getting information about. So when I run a conditional logit, predicting which final choice you make, controlling for your initial choice, you see a very clear response both to the position number and to a simple model of expected waiting time in applicants' decisions. Okay, so the negative coefficient means that you get told a higher position number for a development, you're less likely to choose it. Okay, so when I found this, I was quite excited because first of all, I had spent a lot of time looking for a response to queue lengths at the initial choice stage, and I got nothing. I was like, that's weird. But I went and talked to the Cambridge Housing Authority, and what they explained is that they don't provide information about specific queue lengths. You can call them up and ask for your position on the wait list once you're in the queue, but it's not something people are usually told when they first apply. And in contrast, they're giving people this information explicitly at the final choice. So based on that, it seemed reasonable to assume that applicants who make the same initial choice are basically drawing their preferences from the same distribution, but then responding to this information at the final choice. Okay. So now I'm going to talk about how to do structural estimation with waitlist data. The goal here is to recover 2 things. The first is the distribution of flow payoffs. So what we can learn from choices is these differences, Vij minus Vi0. The second parameter I'd like to recover is the discount factor, because that plus the distribution of values is going to determine sensitivity to waiting time and how choices might change in counterfactuals. Okay. So given the motivation of this trade-off that might exist between efficiency and redistribution, I'm also quite interested in separating 2 dimensions of preference heterogeneity. The first is what I call the value of assistance in the paper. This is the individual effect eta that shifts your value of all public housing developments up or down. Okay, that's just the value of getting something. And then there are match values, the value of being matched to specific developments. Those were the epsilons in our previous notation. Okay. So to estimate preferences, the next question is, what are the different approaches we can take? So Paolo talked about how with static mechanisms, there can be several different ways you might approach estimation. In some cases, it might be reasonable to take reports as truthful. Other cases, you can exploit properties like stability of the match. Those properties are not going to hold in the Cambridge mechanism. So instead, I need an explicit model of strategic behavior that lets me interpret the choices applicants are making. So the choice of what model to use is actually kind of tricky because, as you'll see in even more detail, the Cambridge mechanism kind of requires complicated strategizing, right? It's a two-stage choice problem where you get new information in the second stage. So there's a question of whether we should think about applicants as being completely sophisticated. What I chose to do was start with a rational benchmark. Let's suppose applicants fully understand the Cambridge mechanism, they have rational expectations, beliefs. Let's estimate preferences given that assumption, and then assess robustness to other types of beliefs and other choice heuristics, okay? That was the best I can do in this application. Okay. So if you are a very sophisticated applicant, you are going to think about this two-stage portfolio choice problem and solve it backwards. There isn't actually any nice shortcut to solving this problem. You pretty much just have to do it by brute force. So you would start by thinking about the final choice and all of the different situations you could be in when you get there. That situation depends on your initial choice, which I'm going to call this C, and the information you get, which are the list positions P, which tell you how many people are in front of you on each of the lists in your choice set. Given P, you're going to update your beliefs and choose the development with the highest expected discounted payout, given your updated beliefs about waiting time. Now, anticipating that you're going to make this final choice optimally, you then choose your initial choice to maximize the value of the final choice. And what you have to take expectations over is both when you're asked to make the final choice and what information you're going to get. Okay, and those distributions could be initial choice specific. So that's the two-stage choice problem. The next question is, what determines the decision to apply? So you might think there's a whole literature in public economics on sort of barriers to applying for benefits. In public housing, a lot of the actual ordeal of applying for housing comes later on in the application process when you have to verify eligibility. You might have to break your lease to move into a unit. But there's actually very little cost of just submitting an application. And I also didn't have a good way to identify application costs empirically. You would need something that changes either the cost of applying or the value of the net present value of the application process, or otherwise. So I went with an assumption of no application cost. That means that applicants will apply if any development is preferred to their outside option, because the net present value of the application process is weakly positive. Economically, what that assumption implies is that if we change the mechanism, so make it better or worse, that's not going to affect who applies. It's just going to affect what they do, conditional on apply.
Is there an issue of awareness that a lot of people may not be aware that they could apply for the program?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I would love to know the answer to that. I think that what you would need to assume for the results I'm going to show you to be valid is that if you change the allocation process, that doesn't really affect these information frictions, that those are just determined by something else, and that the value of applying for public housing isn't going to be so different that people suddenly start learning about it and realizing they should try to get it.
But in potential, there's a lot of eligible people who don't apply.
Absolutely. And it could be possible that the waiting times are a deterrent. It's something I don't know. And I think you would probably need survey evidence or a large policy change to be able to assess that. But I think that's an important question. Okay. Great. So I'm a little short on time. So I am actually going to skip one of my favorite things about the paper, which is that, well, let me say a couple of things. So I've specified a random utility model and a model of strategic behavior. That will allow me to estimate preferences in terms of these differences in flow payouts, okay? Right, and this is related to something we've talked about repeatedly this week, which is that discrete choice models only identify differences in payouts, right? So we can only learn the difference between the value of an assignment and your outside option. That's fine for positive analysis, right? That'll allow us to predict counterfactual behavior. But the motivating question in this paper is partly normative, right? It's, if we change the mechanism, is that going to do a better job targeting the people we might especially want to assist? So in the paper, I provide a specific microfoundation of utility that allows me first to map these value differences, these Vij minus Vi zeros, to outside options. So what it essentially allows me to do is treat the value of the outside option as known up to a couple parameters that I'm going to estimate. It's also going to allow me provide a basis for interpersonal comparisons by letting me convert these flow payoffs into equivalent cash transfers. So that gives me a money metric, and that lets me aggregate preferences in a disciplined way. Okay, so the specific model is quite stylized. What it does is it gives me a decomposition of the values that's both useful for how I parameterize the model and for interpreting the estimates. Okay, so you can write the difference in flow payoffs as having two parts. The first part is the analog of the A to I term I talked about earlier. This is just your overall value of assistance that isn't specific to what you're assigned. So that includes the value of the rent subsidy you get in public housing and whatever you have left over for consumption and the full value of your outside option. Those don't depend on what you're assigned. The second term is your match value, okay? And that depends on all the characteristics of your assignment. Now, in this model, when you think about choice behavior on a wait list, sorry about that, the value of assistance and match values are going to be important for determining what choices you make. Do you choose a development that you actually want, or do you choose one with a shorter waiting time? Do you reject an offer that's mismatched to you? Okay. And what this model is assuming is that conditional on observables, applicants who have higher values of assistance, so this higher individual effect, also have higher marginal utilities of income. They have worse outside options, conditional on observables. Okay. So it's a very stylized model. There are lots of things you might think are unrealistic about it, but what it does is actually useful in the sense that it provides an upper bound. It's sort of a best case scenario for the targeting gains that you would get from choice restrictions, right? Because behavior in the mechanism and people's willingness to accept or reject offers is very closely linked to their outside option. Okay, it's not just noise. Okay, that's one thing that this microfoundation does. And again, the other thing it does is it lets me convert the values of assignments to equivalent variation. Or what I'm thinking about is what cash transfer, if you didn't have public housing, would make you as well off as a particular public housing assignment. Okay, then we can make interpersonal comparisons. Okay, it took me a long time to get to this, by the way. From the last bit. Okay, so that decomposition also guided how I parameterize the model. Okay, so the parameterization of flow payoffs looks a lot like standard discrete choice models. We have terms that enter the match value, which include applicant and development characteristics that are observed. In some specifications, I also allow for random coefficients on development characteristics, and then there are idiosyncratic cases. The value of assistance has the value of the rent subsidy and the outside option. And also, I assume that observed characteristics like race and family structure enter the value of assistance, but not the outside option, conditional on income. There's a third component, which actually generalizes the types of preference models that the theory has looked at, which is development quality. So I allow each development to have a different development fixed effect. Okay. One thing that I don't do is try to project delta on development characteristics and recover unobserved development quality. So that's something you might want to do if you wanted to consider a question like what new public housing should be built? What characteristics would applicants most value? In my counterfactuals, I'm holding supply fixed, so I'm not solving that problem. So I parameterize the unobservables, and that gives me a set of model parameters that include the discount factor and all of the parameters governing flow payoffs. One parameter I want to highlight is this sigma eta, which is the variance of the individual effect, the value of assistance, right? That's going to basically determine how much unobserved heterogeneity there is in outside options in this model. Okay. So how do I estimate this? Well, the first thing I'm going to do is, take a page from the usual playbook and treat each agent as solving a single agent problem within a dynamic game. Okay, now there's actually a stronger sense in which I do it in this paper, because in a dynamic game, you can still think about each agent as playing against the distribution of states that your competitor's actions would induce. But in dynamic oligopoly, you think about how your competitors will react in the future to your actions. In a first come first served queue, you actually don't have that kind of strategic interaction, because anyone whose waiting times I would impact by my choice is behind me. And any response that they make is not going to affect my waiting times. So there's actually a stronger sense in which this is a single agent problem. Even in other settings, so Nikhil will talk about kidneys where it's not purely first come first served, it can be reasonable to take this view if individuals are small relative to the market, and you don't have a lot of information about the specific decisions of your competitors. So given that, estimation proceeds as follows. First, I need a model of beliefs, and I start with a rational expectations benchmark that I construct by simulation. And then I estimate preferences using the method of simulated moments based on optimal initial and final choices and the decision to apply. Okay, so that avoids solving for the equilibrium of the game, but still lets me recover preferences. So constructing beliefs was actually a tricky part of this exercise, because in the Cambridge mechanisms, beliefs are high dimensional objects, right? So if you think about the structure of the application process where applicants are getting new information and responding to it in the middle, that introduces a lot of state dependence, which then generates correlation in waiting times across developments. So in principle, you have to think about how each initial choice affects when you're going to be asked to make the final choice and what information you're going to get. And you have to think about how you're going to update beliefs given any information that you might get at the final choice state, right? And the way you interpret that information might depend on your initial choice as well as the development that it's for, okay? So this is a pretty high dimensional set of belief objects. And in contrast, in the data, I don't see that many applicants getting asked. So there aren't that many waiting times actually observed. So to construct beliefs, I rely pretty heavily on the structure of the Cambridge mechanism. What I do is I use the fact that I know how the mechanism works and can simulate it. And also that the determinants of the stationary distribution of the mechanism in equilibrium is going to depend on the lower dimensional set of objects, right? So if you think about what's going to generate waiting times, the distribution of waiting times that people actually face, well, really it's the rate at which applicants arrive, it's the rate at which vacancies occur, and it's the rate at which applicants depart exogenously. It also is going to depend on the choices that agents make, both at the initial and final choice stages. But I can estimate reduced form models of all of those parameters, plug them into a simulation of the Cambridge mechanism, and construct belief distributions from the outputs of the simulation. And that will be an approximation of the mechanism's stationary distribution. Okay.
Can you do this iteratively, like, you have this initial one, but it's not based on your final estimates, then do it again and again until it converges?
Definitely. That would be the full solution approach, right? So the only reason I didn't do that is computational.
Yeah.
It took a fairly long time to construct these beliefs, estimate preferences. So iterating between them would have just been intractable. But I think that is, that would have been a more efficient estimator for sure.
Yeah.
In counterfactuals, I will do that. And I'm going to set things up so that the choice problem is simpler.
Okay.
So I can do it. Yeah.
Do you have to worry about having a truncated distribution of beliefs because people might not even apply? Like, I know it's costless to apply, but if you believe that you're never going to get housing, you might just move, or like you won't even be in the sample.
Yeah. So that's I think an important point that's outside the model. So I've assumed that there's no cost of applying. So no matter, as long as you think there's some probability of getting something that you prefer to your outside option, you're going to apply. But in practice, I think it's an empirical question whether people are deterred by really long waiting times. Another related question is there heterogeneity in beliefs? Right now, I'm assuming that everyone has a common prior, right? That's a natural starting point, but I think there's some good evidence in static mechanisms like school choice that people differ a lot in their understanding of the mechanism and their beliefs about their assignment probabilities. So I think empirically, that's an important direction to go.
You talked a lot about how you need to like keep going into like these appointments to like maintain your spot on the waiting list. Theoretically, that's.
You don't. So there's, yeah, so you're basically not contacted until you're asked to make the final choice, but you don't have to go in for that. You just send back a letter. And then really the thing that actually takes time is coming in to verify your eligibility way at the end. So you're already pretty much at the end of the process. Okay, so I estimated this model by method of simulated moments. I would have really liked to be able to use a likelihood-based approach because I don't have a ton of data and you use a lot more information by doing maximum likelihood. The challenge in my setting was that because the choice problem is so complicated and there's so many possible choices, that generates a complicated region of values for which each choice would be optimal. And so I couldn't figure out a tractable way to either do numerical integration or use a Bayesian method like MCMC. Also, if you wanted to do simulated maximum likelihood, you would probably have a lot of concerns about simulation bias because there are lots of choices and most of them would never be picked by your simulated agents. So because of that, I'm stuck with method of simulated moments. You guys now know very well how to do that, but basically you take simulation draws at the outset. One thing I should mention here is that these draws include both preference components and final choice states that you would reach if you made different decisions. Okay, so that's something that's also important to hold fixed in the simulation. Then you know, for a candidate parameter value, you solve the optimal choice problem for your simulated agents and construct moments based on the decisions. Okay. So I'm saying intuition for identification here because I don't have a formal identification argument. You can see, I think, pretty clearly how in a one-stage choice mechanism, you could adapt the arguments in Agrawal-Samaini to argue for identification, either with a special regressor or with variation in priorities or waiting times. In this case, things are a little more complicated because I'm interested in identifying the distribution of flow payoffs and the discount rate. And I have this more complicated choice problem with 3 stages, but I'll give a little intuition for how I think the data are informative about the primitives I'm interested in. For one thing, the initial choice of 3 developments is a lot like having second choice data. So it's not ordered, it's not a rank order list, but you can still see which developments tend to be chosen together by the same applicants and how well that's predicted by observables versus things we can't explain. So that gives me a lot of information about both match values and values of assistance. The other thing that's useful is that the decision to apply reveals a lot of observed heterogeneity in the value of assistance, right? You see very clearly that lower income households are much more likely to apply, and that suggests they have a higher value of just getting something overall. Okay. Now, one of the things I'm interested in is unobserved heterogeneity in the value of assistance, which I'm interpreting as part of the outside option. That's actually something that I would have liked to be able to have better empirical purchase on, right? I think what you would ideally do is have some information that the housing authority doesn't have access to about what people's lives are like outside of public housing and show that that's actually correlated with choices. Here, I'm using behavior in the mechanism to infer what people's outside options are. And it's basically taking differences in selectivity that can't be explained by observed characteristics or match value management and attributing that to differences in outside options. That's something where I think with better data, you could do a much more credible job understanding that. And then the last piece, which is kind of nice about, I think, this setting is that I was able to estimate a discount factor because of the variation in waiting time at the final choice stage, right? So that basically takes observably similar applicants who made the same initial choices and quotes them different waiting times, okay? So I'm going to estimate a discount factor that's common to everyone and a distribution of flow payoffs. Okay, I'm really out of time. So I'm going to talk not at all about the moments, but they follow that logic, and very little about the estimates. There's quite a bit of unobserved heterogeneity in both match values and the value of assistance. And applicants actually turned out to be pretty patient. It was tough to estimate the discount factor, but it ends up seeming as though people don't anticipate the rate at which they're going to drop off of the list. So I'm going to talk very quickly about counterfactuals, try to finish just 1 or 2 minutes over. So again, what I'm interested in is the trade-off between efficiency and redistribution in waitlist design. By efficiency, I mean maximizing the equivalent variation from assignments, okay? So I'm using utilitarian criteria, like what we talked about. The other goal is redistribution. And by that, I mean whether these transfers, these assignments go to applicants with the worst outside options, okay? And I'll actually have a way of combining them at the end of the talk. So for counterfactuals, I'm going to consider combinations of choice and priority that model what PHAs are actually doing. On the choice side, I'm going to consider choose one and no choice. I also think about some intermediate systems in the paper. And for priority, I'm going to think about high or low income applicants. This is modeling the fact that some cities seem to prioritize the most economically vulnerable, others the least. Okay, and I'm going to compare that to equal priority, which is what the Cambridge Housing Authority is doing. Okay, so these mechanisms are motivated by a combination of theory and practice and a little bit of convenience, because it turns out that one stage of choice, which are the systems I'm going to look at here, are just much computationally easier to analyze. Okay, so I'm not going to say much about equilibrium computation, except that there's a nice representation of a one-stage choice problem in terms of weights on utilities. Okay, so computing the equilibrium is basically finding a fixed point between optimal decisions and these weights, which depend on the choice that you make. Okay, so what do I get out of this? Well, there's definitely a trade-off between efficiency and redistribution. If you look at the comparison between choose one and no choice under equal priority, this reduces efficiency by almost a third, right? People are really poorly matched, but it does do a better job targeting applicants with worse outside options, okay? In contrast, income-based priorities affect redistribution, but not so much efficiency, okay? So the last thing I want to do is find a way to combine these two goals, okay? So if we only cared about efficiency, we could just use the leftmost graph to decide which mechanism to use, but we also might care about distributional objectives. So I'm going to aggregate the equivalent variation from assignments using a social welfare function that places greater value on transferring to households with worse outside options. To do this, I use some ideas from welfare economics that were established a long time ago. And I use a particular parametric class of social welfare functions where the value of redistribution is parameterized by this parameter lambda. So I mean that the social marginal utility of income is lambda % greater for a 1% lower income household. It's literally what lambda means. It also has a connection to the constant relative risk aversion parameter you would get in a utility function. So if lambda is 0, we don't care about redistribution at all. We just care about efficiency. As lambda grows, we care more and more about just making transfers to the very poorest. Okay. So now I can apply this social welfare function, and I can't tell you what our preference for redistribution should be as a society, but I can tell you, if you tell me your value, what mechanism should we use. So this is comparing choose one and no choice under equal priority. And what you see is that no choice is much worse than choose one if you only care about efficiency, but with a high enough value of redistribution, you can justify choice restrictions. That's also true when you consider all mechanisms together. The one thing that I'll say two things about the results here. The first is that when you look at what mechanism would be optimal at different values of redistribution, this suggests that you should first prioritize low-income applicants and only remove choice as a last resort once you've exhausted what you can do with income-based priorities. So intuitively, right, removing choice is a very costly distortion. It's a very costly way to improve targeting. And you should probably try to use observables to the extent that you can, unless you're very worried about strong behavioral responses. Okay. So sorry for going over. I'm going to stop here. Thank you for bearing with me. And I'm going to leave up this slide and just say that I think there are tons of interesting directions to go.